Cora Halloran dropped her two carpet bags on the dirt of the Thorn Ranch yard and said the one thing a desperate woman was never supposed to say. She said it not to the wind or to the tired-looking boy beside her, but to the tall, weathered man who stood on the porch of the main house as if he had grown there. Rooted in the warped planking, his face was a study in suspicion, his eyes the gray of creek stones after rain. "I am not here for charity," she said. Her voice was steady, a surprise even to herself. It did not carry the tremor of the last 3 days spent walking, nor the gnawing ache of the last 6 months spent losing everything. The man, Elias Thorne, did not move. He was a silhouette against the glaring afternoon sun, all sharp angles and weariness. He had seen women like this before, widows mostly, drifters' wives left behind. They came with pleading eyes and stories of woe, looking for a soft heart and a handout. His heart was not soft. It had been hardened by drought, by rustlers, and by the profound grinding loneliness of the high country. "I don't run a charity, ma'am," he replied, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder that never broke. "This is a working cattle ranch, or what's left of one." Cora's gaze swept over the yard. She saw the evidence of what he meant: a sagging fence line near the barn, a broken wagon wheel leaning against the bunkhouse, a general air of things being held together by stubbornness rather than repair. It was a place teetering on the edge, much like herself. Her son, Leo, a boy of 7 who had not spoken a word since his father's funeral, pressed closer to her leg. His small hand clutched a fold of her dusty skirt. "I can work," Cora stated. It was not a plea. It was a fact. "I can cook, clean, mend, garden. I can keep accounts. I ran a 2,000-acre spread with my husband for 10 years before the fever took him and the bank took the rest." Elias Thorne's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted. A flicker of interest, perhaps, or just the breaking of his initial, solid rejection. He looked from her face, clean but etched with fatigue, to the boy's pale, silent countenance. A child was a complication he did not need. Another mouth to feed, another soul to worry about when the winter snows came. "The last cook I hired drank himself sick on vanilla extract and tried to trade a side of beef for a bottle of whiskey," he said, the words flat and dry as the dust at their feet. "The one before that ran off with a drifter after 2 weeks. I'm short on trust, Mrs. Halloran," she supplied. "Cora Halloran. This is my son, Leo." Just then, a commotion erupted from the direction of the corral. A young ranch hand, no more than 18, was fighting with a half-wild gelding. The horse reared, its eyes white with panic, its hooves striking the air with deadly force. The boy Ben stumbled backward, losing his grip on the lead rope. The horse bolted, heading straight for the open gate and the vast unfenced prairie beyond. Two other hands, one a grizzled old-timer named Samuel, and the other a stocky, resentful-looking man called Jed, shouted and scrambled, but they were too far away. Elias Thorne cursed under his breath, taking a step off the porch as if to intervene himself, though he knew he was too late. Cora did not hesitate. Her movements were economical, born of long practice. She stepped directly into the horse's path, not with aggression, but with a strange and sudden calm. She did not shout. She did not wave her arms. She simply stood her ground, her body language conveying an absolute lack of threat. And she began to hum. It was a low, tuneless sound, a simple rising and falling note that seemed to cut through the animal's panic. The gelding, expecting a chase or a blow, faltered. It slowed, its ears twitching, its head high. It saw this unmoving figure, this source of quiet sound, and its frantic momentum broke. It stopped a dozen feet from her, snorting, sides heaving. Cora continued to hum, her eyes soft, her hands held loosely at her sides. She took one slow, deliberate step sideways, angling her body away from it, a gesture of submission. The horse lowered its head, blowing air through its nostrils. Ben, the young hand, crept forward cautiously and retrieved the rope. The crisis was over. It had lasted less than 30 seconds. Silence descended on the yard, broken only by the nervous panting of the horse and the whisper of the wind. Jed stared, his mouth slightly agape. Samuel, the old hand, pushed his hat back and slowly nodded once, a gesture of profound approval. Elias Thorne looked at Cora Halloran. He looked at her dusty dress and her worn-out boots. He looked at the quiet dignity in her stance and the absolute competence she had just displayed. He looked at the silent boy hiding behind her skirts. He was a man who believed in what he could see, and he had just seen something remarkable. He was still a man short on trust, but he was also a man who recognized a tool when he saw it, whether it was a good rope or a capable woman. "The bunkhouse cooking is a disgrace," he said, his tone still gruff, betraying none of his inner thoughts. "The place is a mess. The books haven't been balanced in a year." "I can fix that," Cora said simply. Elias considered her, his gaze unwavering. He was making a calculation, weighing the risk of another disappointment against the evidence before him. He saw the faint hope in her eyes, but more than that, he saw the steel beneath it. This wasn't a plea for a roof. It was an application for a job. 30 days, he said, the word sharp as a new nail. You get room and board for you and the boy. You run the house, the kitchen, the supplies. In 30 days, we'll see if it's working. If it is, we'll talk wages. If it isn't, you move on. No arguments. It was a harsh offer, a probationary sentence. But it was also a foothold. Cora felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees, but she allowed none of it to show. "Agreed," she said, her voice clear and firm. She held out her hand. Elias Thorne looked at her offered hand for a long moment before taking it. Her grip was firm, her skin calloused. It was not the hand of a helpless woman, it was the hand of a partner. He released it quickly, as if the contact had burned him. "The small cabin behind the main house is empty. It's yours," he grunted, turning away. "Ben, show her, then get back to your work." As Cora picked up her bags, her son still clinging to her, she watched Elias Thorne walk back into the house. She had not won his trust. She had not even earned his kindness, but she had earned a chance. In this harsh, unforgiving land, a chance was the most valuable currency there was. It was the seed from which a new life might, with considerable effort, be grown. And Cora Halloran was, if nothing else, a patient and determined gardener. Music. The first thing Cora did was not unpack. It was not rest. It was to wage a quiet, methodical war. Her first battlefield was the kitchen of the main house, a place that had clearly seen nothing but masculine neglect for a very long time. A film of greasy dust coated every surface. The air was thick with the ghosts of burned bacon and stale coffee. Pots were piled in the dry sink, and the floor was a geography of old mud and spilled food. Leo sat on a stool in the corner, a small, silent island of stillness in the chaos, watching his mother. He had watched her take apart their old life and pack it into 2 bags, and now he watched her begin to build a new one. Cora tied an apron she'd made from a flour sack over her dress and began. There was no fury in her movements, no frantic scrubbing. There was only a calm, efficient economy of motion that was more powerful than any rage. She heated water on the big cast-iron stove, her hands moving with a familiarity that spoke of 1,000 such tasks. She scraped, she scoured, she washed. She used lye soap and elbow grease, and slowly, inch by inch, the kitchen began to surrender. The ranch hands came in for the evening meal, drawn by a scent that had not graced the Thorne Ranch in years, the smell of baking bread. They stopped in the doorway, their usual loud banter dying on their lips. The floor was swept clean. The stove gleamed a dull, respectable black. The pots and pans hung in neat, orderly rows. And on the long wooden table, which was scrubbed to a pale, bare wood, sat a platter of roasted chicken, a bowl of potatoes, and a basket of fresh, golden brown bread. Jed, the resentful one, looked around with a suspicious scowl, as if this cleanliness were a personal affront. Ben, the young hand, grinned with open delight. Old Samuel simply took his seat, his eyes on the bread, a look of quiet reverence on his face. Elias Thorne came in last. He stopped and surveyed the scene, his face as unreadable as ever. His gaze lingered on the organized shelves, the clean counter, the steaming food. He did not say a word of praise. He did not need to. The transformation of the room was its own testimony. For the first time since his wife had died 5 years prior, the heart of the house felt like it was beating again. Cora served them, moving with the same unhurried grace she'd shown in the yard. She placed a plate before each man. The food was simple, honest, and perfectly cooked. The chicken was juicy, the potatoes were fluffy, and the bread was a revelation. For 10 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the clinking of forks and the low murmurs of appreciation. When the meal was over, Jed pushed his chair back. "It's just food," he muttered, though he had cleaned his plate with a piece of bread. "It's the best food we've had in a year," Ben countered, earning him a glare from Jed. Cora ignored them both, clearing the plates. She had not cooked the meal for praise. She had cooked it as a statement of intent. "This is what I can do. This is the order I can bring." It was the first plank in the foundation of her new life. Later that night, in the small, clean cabin, Cora sat mending one of Leo's shirts by the light of a single candle. The cabin had been as neglected as the kitchen, but a few hours of her determined work had made it habitable. A fire crackled in the small hearth, chasing away the high country chill. Leo was asleep in the small cot she had made up for him, his face peaceful in the flickering light. She was tired, an exhaustion that went bone deep. But it was a good kind of tired. It was the weariness of accomplishment, not of despair. She had laid her claim. She had survived her first day. Looking around the small, sparse room, she felt not the sting of what she had lost, but the first, fragile stirring of what she might build. This was not home. Not yet. But it was a place to begin. The work was hard, the future uncertain, and the man in charge a fortress of stone. But the bread had risen, and that was enough for one day. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by work and the rising and a setting of the sun. Cora rose before dawn, her first task to stir the embers in the kitchen stove back to life. The smell of coffee and frying bacon soon filled the air, a summons to the men in the bunkhouse. She worked tirelessly, moving from the kitchen to the laundry, from the garden she was reclaiming from weeds to the mending pile that seemed to grow of its own accord. She learned the men's habits. Samuel liked his coffee black and strong. Ben had a sweet tooth and would look for any leftover biscuits. Jed complained about everything, a constant grumbling static in the background of the day. But he always ate every scrap on his plate. Her presence began to subtly reshape the ranch. It was not just the cleanliness or the good food. It was the quiet order she imposed. Tools were no longer left where they fell. The men, shamed by the clean house, began to scrape the mud from their boots on the porch. Small civilities, long absent, began to reappear. Ben was her first true ally. He was a good-natured boy, orphaned young and eager for a kind word. He started bringing her small offerings, a clutch of wild bird eggs he found, a handful of late-season berries. He would talk to Leo, even though the boy never answered, telling him about the horses and the cattle, showing him how to braid a piece of twine. Cora would watch them from the kitchen window, a warmth spreading through her chest. Samuel, the old sage, was an ally of a different sort. He rarely spoke to her directly, but she would often find a bucket of fresh water left by her cabin door in the morning, or a stack of firewood neatly piled. His approval was silent but solid, a bedrock of support she could feel even if she could not hear it. Jed, however, remained a bastion of resistance. He saw her not as a helpmate, but as an intruder, a woman in a man's world who was changing things that did not need changing. His resentment simmered, looking for a place to boil over. It came to a head during the third week. Cora had spent 2 days taking a full inventory of the pantry and the storeroom. She had organized everything, labeling sacks and jars, making a detailed list of what they had and what they would need for the coming winter. It was a task Elias had never asked her to do, but one she knew was critical. Jed came into the storeroom as she was finishing, looking for a new coil of rope. He stopped, staring at the neat shelves and her ledger. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice thick with suspicion. "Taking inventory," Cora said calmly, not looking up from her list. "We're low on flour and salt, and the supply of preserved peaches is smaller than you think." "We've always done just fine without a woman telling us what we need," he sneered. "Thorne should have just hired another cook, not a foreman in an apron." Cora finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. She held the heavy ledger in one hand. Her gaze was direct, unwavering, and utterly devoid of fear. A ranch can be broken by a blizzard or a drought, Jed, but it can also be broken by carelessness, by running out of food in February, by not knowing what you have until it's gone. This is my job: the kitchen, the house, and the supplies that feed the men who work here. It ain't your place, he started, taking a step toward her. It is precisely my place. The voice came from the doorway. Elias Thorne stood there, his arms crossed. He had been there for some time listening. His face was grim. Her place is to do the job I gave her, and her job is to make sure this ranch runs properly. That includes knowing what's in this storeroom better than you or I do. Jed froze, his face flushing a dull red. He looked from Elias to Cora and back again. He had expected the boss to side with him, to put the newcomer in her place. Elias took a step into the storeroom. He looked at Cora's neat shelves, then at the open ledger in her hand. He could see the tidy columns, the precise handwriting. He had not asked for this level of competence. He was not sure he even knew what to do with it. But he recognized its value. It was the same value he saw in a good horse or a sturdy fence. It was real. She's right, Elias said, his voice leaving no room for argument. We've been careless. If you have a problem with the way Mrs. Halloran is doing her job, you can bring it to me. Otherwise, get your rope and get back to work. Jed, defeated, snatched a coil of rope from its hook and stalked out, muttering under his breath. The confrontation was over. Cora did not thank Elias. She simply nodded, a small, respectful acknowledgement of his intervention. She had not needed rescuing, but she appreciated the public declaration of support. It solidified her authority. It shifted her status from probationary housekeeper to an essential part of the operation. Elias lingered in the doorway. He looked at her, standing there amidst the sacks of flour and beans, a ledger in her hand instead of a skillet. He had hired a cook. He was beginning to realize he had gotten something far more. "Let me see that list when you're done," he said, his tone still gruff, but the edge of his usual suspicion had softened. It was the closest he had come to praise. Cora watched him go, then turned back to her work. She felt a quiet sense of victory. She had faced down the internal resistance and had been vindicated. She was weaving herself into the fabric of this place, thread by thread. It was not a soft or easy weaving, but it was strong. It was the kind of thing that was meant to last. A week later, on a cool evening, Cora brought the completed inventory ledger to Elias. He was in his small, cluttered office, a room that smelled of old paper, leather, and stale tobacco. A single lantern cast long shadows on the walls, which were covered with maps of his land. He was hunched over a stack of receipts and bills, a frown creasing his forehead. He looked up as she entered, his expression weary. "Mrs. Halloran, I've finished the inventory and cross-referenced it with the supply delivery receipts from the last 6 months," she said, placing her ledger on the corner of his desk. It was a simple, factual statement, but it held the weight of many long nights of work. Elias picked it up. He was a cattleman, not an accountant. He hated paperwork, viewing it as a necessary evil that stole time from real work. He flipped through the pages. He saw her neat columns, her precise calculations. Then he saw the notes she had made in the margins. They were not accusations, but questions. Discrepancy in weight of flour, September 10th. Billed for 5 sacks, received 4. Price of salted pork from Croft's Mercantile 15% higher than market average. Check invoices from last year. He stopped, his finger tracing one of her notes. Silas Croft was his neighbor to the east, a man whose smile was as wide as his acreage and just as false. Croft also owned the nearest mercantile, the only practical source for bulk supplies. Elias had always done business with him, assuming a neighborly fairness that he was now beginning to question. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm not sure," Cora said honestly. "They're just inconsistencies. The numbers don't feel right. When my husband and I ran our place, I handled the books. You develop a sense for it, a pattern. It's possible they're just clerical errors, but they all seem to be errors in Mr. Croft's favor." Elias leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the quiet room. He looked at Cora standing before his desk, her expression serious and her hands clasped calmly in front of her. She was not just a cook who could calm a spooked horse. She was a woman who could read the story told by numbers on a page. She had seen something he had missed for years, either through lack of time or lack of inclination. He had been focused on the threats he could see, the wolves, the weather, the failing price of beef. He had not been looking for the threat hidden in plain sight, in the friendly invoices of his neighbor. Silas Croft, Elias said the name slowly, tasting it. He thought of Croft's easy handshakes, his offers of help that always seemed to come with a hidden cost. He thought of the way Croft was always buying up small parcels of land from ranchers who went bust. "I may be wrong," Cora said quietly, "but I thought you should know." "No," he said, his eyes still on the ledger. "You're not wrong." He felt a cold knot of anger in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a different feeling, a profound and startling sense of gratitude. This woman, in less than a month, had done more to protect his ranch than anyone he had employed in years. She had seen the leak he had been too busy to notice, the slow bleeding of his resources that, over time, could be as fatal as any drought. He closed the ledger and pushed himself up from the desk. He walked to the window and stared out into the darkness, at the vast, silent land that was his life's work. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice softer than Cora had ever heard it. "She used to handle all of this. She had a mind for numbers, a mind for everything. When she passed, I think a part of this ranch passed with her. I've just been trying to hold on to the rest of it." It was a confession, a glimpse into the fortress of his solitude. Cora remained silent, understanding that he was not speaking to her so much as thinking aloud, giving voice to a long-held grief. He turned back from the window. The weariness was still in his face, but it was joined by a new resolve. "Thank you, Mrs. Halloran," he said. The words were simple, but they carried an immense weight. It was the first time he had thanked her for anything. It was an acknowledgement of her value beyond the kitchen, beyond the terms of their initial bargain. "The 30 days are almost up," he continued, his tone becoming more businesslike, as if to cover the brief moment of vulnerability. This is more than I hired you for." "It all felt like part of the same job," Cora replied, "keeping the ranch healthy." A ghost of a smile touched Elias Thorne's lips. It was a rare and fleeting thing, but it changed his entire face, softening the hard lines for an instant. "Well, it seems I've been getting a bargain." He picked up the ledger again, his mind already working, planning his next conversation with Silas Croft. "We'll need to talk about proper wages, a permanent position." Cora felt the last of the tension she had been carrying for months begin to dissolve. It was not just a job anymore. It was a place. It was a future. She looked from Elias, now absorbed in her work, to the maps on the wall. For the first time, she did not just see the lines and boundaries of his property. She saw a place she was helping to defend, a place she was helping to build, a place that was, against all odds, beginning to feel like home. The first snow of the season came early that year, a fine dusting powder that turned the brown hills to a ghostly white overnight. It was a warning, a prelude to the harsh winter to come. With the knowledge from Cora's ledgers, Elias had become more cautious in his dealings. He rode into the nearby town of Redemption to meet with the freight agent himself, bypassing Croft's mercantile for a direct order of winter supplies. It was a clear message to Silas Croft, and one that Elias knew would not be taken lightly. He was due back in 2 days. The day after he left, the sky turned a bruised, ugly gray. The wind picked up, howling down from the northern peaks with a bitter, razor-sharp edge. The dusting of snow thickened into a driving curtain of white. By midday, it was a full-blown blizzard. Cora stood at the kitchen window, watching the world disappear. The barn, only 100 yards away, was a faint, hazy outline. The wind shrieked around the corners of the house, rattling the window panes. Leo, sensing the gravity of the storm, sat quietly by the fire, his small face tight with worry. The men came in from their morning chores early, their faces red with the cold, their mustaches caked with ice. They stamped the snow from their boots, their movements urgent. "Never seen one come on this fast," Samuel said, his voice grim as he unwound the scarf from his neck. "Thorne's going to be trapped in Redemption for days." Jed paced the kitchen, his agitation palpable. "What about the north herd? They're in the high pasture. They'll drift with the storm and pile up in the canyons. We'll lose half of them." We can't get to them in this, Ben argued, his youthful confidence shaken. We'd be lucky to make it to the barn and back without getting lost. An argument broke out, a mix of fear and frustration. With Elias gone, the chain of command was broken. Jed, by virtue of seniority, felt he should be in charge, but his only solution was to wait it out, to accept the loss of the cattle as inevitable. Samuel was too old for a fool's errand in a blizzard, and Ben was too young to have his opinion respected. The ranch was paralyzed. Cora let them argue for a minute, her mind working quickly. She thought of the maps in Elias's office. She thought of the long hours she'd spent not just with the ledgers, but with every piece of paper that told the story of the ranch. She knew this land now, not just as a place, but as a system, a living thing with vulnerabilities. There's the old line shack, she said, her voice cutting through their argument. The men stopped and looked at her. The one in Willow Creek Canyon, she continued, her voice gaining strength. It's sheltered from the north wind by the rock wall. The herd knows that canyon. It's their best chance. If we can get them turned and moving south toward it, they might have a chance. Jed scoffed. And how do you propose we do that? The canyon's 5 miles from here. We can't see 10 feet in front of our faces. The fence line, Cora said immediately. The south fence runs almost straight to the ridge above the canyon. If you can find the fence, you can follow it. It will guide you. Silence fell in the kitchen. The men looked at each other, then back at her. It was a desperate plan, but it was a plan. It was more than any of them had come up with. She was not just quoting vague knowledge. She was giving them a precise, actionable strategy. Samuel was the first to nod. The woman's right. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot we've got. It's suicide, Jed spat. I'm not risking my neck for a few cows on the say-so of a cook. Cora looked directly at him, her eyes as cold as the wind outside. This isn't about a few cows, Jed. This is about the ranch surviving the winter. Elias is counting on us to protect it while he's gone. Are you going to do your job, or are you going to sit by the fire and wait for him to come home and find it ruined? Her words hit their mark. She had appealed not just to their duty, but to their loyalty to Thorne. Jed's face darkened, but he had no answer. Ben, Samuel, get the strongest horses, Cora commanded, her voice ringing with an authority none of them had heard before. Get ropes, lanterns, and all the oilskins you can find. I'll pack food and coffee. She was no longer asking for permission. With Elias trapped by the storm, she had taken charge. There was a power vacuum, and her quiet competence had just filled it. As the men prepared to leave, a new sound reached them over the howl of the wind. A low, desperate bellowing. It was close. Too close. Ben threw open the door, and a blast of snow and icy air filled the room. Through the swirling white, they could see them. A small group of cattle, part of the herd from the home pasture, disoriented and drifting blindly. And behind them, a figure on horseback pushing them. It was Silas Croft. He was wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat, his face barely visible, but his intent was clear. He was not helping. He was driving the cattle away from the relative shelter of the barn, pushing them out into the open plains where the storm would finish them. It was a petty, vicious act of sabotage, revenge for Elias's decision to take his business elsewhere. Jed let out a roar of rage. That son of a... There's no time for him, Cora said sharply, her focus absolute. Let him go. Our job is the North herd. They're the future of this ranch. Go! Follow the fence line. Get them to the canyon. Her clarity cut through their anger. She was right. Chasing Croft in this storm was a fool's errand and would waste precious time. The real prize was the main herd. Samuel and Ben, their faces set with determination, nodded at her. Even Jed, his resentment momentarily forgotten in the face of a common enemy and a clear plan, gave a curt, grudging nod. They pulled on their heavy coats, checked their gear, and stepped out into the raging blizzard. Cora watched them go, 3 small figures swallowed almost instantly by the white chaos. She closed the door, the warmth of the kitchen a fragile sanctuary against the storm's fury. She stood for a moment, her heart pounding. She had just sent those men into the teeth of a killer storm, betting their lives on her knowledge of a map and a fence line. She had taken the fate of the Thorne Ranch into her hands. She turned and looked at Leo, who was watching her, his eyes wide. She went to him and knelt, pulling his small body into a fierce hug. He was the reason she fought so hard. He was the reason she could not fail. Outside, the blizzard raged, and Silas Croft worked his bitter mischief. But inside the small house, its heart was still beating, kept alive by a woman who had arrived with nothing but 2 carpetbags and an unbreakable will. Clear your throat. The house grew cold. Despite the fire roaring in the hearth, the wind found every crack and crevice, its mournful howl a constant reminder of the men outside. Cora worked to keep herself busy, to fight off the gnawing anxiety. She baked more bread, the simple physical act of kneading the dough a comfort. She made a thick, hearty stew, filling the house with its savory aroma, a promise of warmth and sustenance for the men's return. She did not know if they would return. Leo stayed close, a silent shadow at her side. He seemed to understand the weight of the moment. He helped her by stacking kindling by the fire, his small hands careful and precise. The shared quiet work was a conversation more meaningful than any words. Hours passed, stretching into an eternity. The light outside began to fade, the gray day sinking into a terrifying white-lashed darkness. Cora lit every lantern in the house, placing one in each window, turning the small building into a beacon against the storm. It was a small gesture, perhaps a futile one, but it was all she could do. It was an act of faith. Just as true darkness fell, she heard it, a faint shout nearly lost in the wind. Her heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the door and threw it open, shielding her face against the blast of snow. 3 figures, looking more like snow-caked monsters than men, were staggering out of the swirling darkness, leading their exhausted horses toward the light of the barn. It was them. They were back. Cora pulled on a heavy coat and ran to meet them, Leo trailing behind her. The men were frozen, their movements stiff, their beards thick with ice. But they were alive. "Did you—" She could barely get the words out. Samuel nodded, his face a mask of exhaustion. "We found them, piled up against the ridge, just like you said. We got them turned, pushed them down into the canyon." He looked at her, his tired eyes filled with a new and profound respect. "Your plan worked, Mrs. Halloran. You saved the herd." Jed, leaning heavily against his horse, said nothing, but he did not meet her eyes. It was an admission of its own. He had been wrong about her, and he knew it. Relief washed over Cora, so powerful it left her weak. They spent the next hour tending to the horses, rubbing them down, giving them warm mash. The animals had performed a miracle, and they were treated as heroes. Then the men stumbled into the warmth of the kitchen, drawn by the light and the smell of stew. They ate in silence at first, too tired for words. The hot food slowly thawed their frozen bodies and spirits. Cora refilled their bowls and their coffee cups, her movements quiet and reassuring. She was their anchor in the storm. It was Ben who finally broke the silence. "We wouldn't have made it without the fence," he said, his voice filled with awe. "We got lost twice, couldn't see a thing. But then we'd find the wire again. It was like a lifeline, leading us right where we needed to go." He looked at Cora. "How did you know?" "I study things," Cora said simply. "When you don't have much, you learn to pay attention to what you have." Before anyone could respond, the kitchen door burst open. Silas Croft stood there, covered in snow, his face purple with rage and cold. His horse was gone, likely lost to the storm. He had seen the lights of the house and stumbled towards it, his last, best hope for survival. "Thorn!" he bellowed, his eyes wild. "Where is that gutless coward?" "He's in redemption," Cora said, stepping between Croft and the men at the table. She held a heavy iron skillet in her hand, having just taken it from the stove. She did not raise it, but its presence was a clear and potent statement. "And you are not welcome in this house." Croft's eyes narrowed, focusing on her. "You, the new woman. You're the one who's been filling his head with lies about my accounts." He took a staggering step into the room. "I saw you. I saw your men. You think you've won something? When this storm clears, Thorn will be ruined. I'll pick up this ranch for pennies on the dollar." "You drove his cattle into the storm," Jed growled, getting to his feet. Samuel and Ben rose with him. The 3 exhausted men formed a wall behind Cora. Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You can't prove a thing. It'll be my word against yours, and my word carries a little more weight in this county." "Perhaps," Cora said, her voice dangerously calm. "But people might wonder why your prize bowl, the one you paid $500 for last spring, has my husband's brand painted over on its flank. The H from Halloran is hard to hide under the C from Croft, if you know where to look." Croft froze. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly white. He had bought the bull at a fire sale after Cora's husband had died, a piece of predatory opportunism. He never imagined the widow would end up on his neighbor's ranch, 100 miles away. It was a bluff. Cora had no idea if he still had the bull or if the brand was visible, but it was an educated guess, based on the kind of man she knew him to be. She had seen the way he looked at their prize stock, the envy in his eyes. "And they might also wonder," she continued, pressing her advantage, "about the telegram I had Ben send from Redemption before the lines went down. The one to the Miller Grain Company in Cheyenne, asking them to confirm the weight and price of the last 3 shipments they sent to you for Elias. The shipments you delivered. It's funny how numbers travel, even in a storm." This was not a bluff. It was the intellectual victory, the culmination of her work in the ledgers. It was a checkmate he had never seen coming. Ben had left for town hours before Elias on a separate errand she had devised. Silas Croft stared at her, his blustering rage collapsing into stunned disbelief. He was beaten, not by force, not by violence, but by a quiet woman with a sharp eye for numbers and an even sharper understanding of character. He had been outmaneuvered, his greed and cruelty exposed by methodical competence. "Get out," Cora said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, which was somehow more menacing than a shout. Croft looked at her, at the skillet in her hand, and at the 3 weary but resolute men behind her. He saw no mercy in their eyes. He saw only the reflection of his own failure. Without another word, he turned and stumbled back out into the blizzard, a man defeated by an apron and a ledger. The storm swallowed him from sight. Cora closed the door and leaned against it, the heavy skillet suddenly feeling like it weighed a ton. The kitchen was silent. The men stared at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and profound admiration. She had not only saved the herd, she had vanquished the enemy. She had protected the heart of the ranch from the inside out. In the absence of the owner, she had become its fierce and capable guardian. The blizzard broke 2 days later, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white. The sun shone on a landscape transformed, pristine and peaceful. The air was clean and cold. From the canyon, the lowing of the saved herd could be heard, a sound of survival. Elias Thorne rode in that afternoon, his face etched with worry. He had spent 2 agonizing days in Redemption, imagining the worst. He saw the clear paths to the barn, the smoke rising cheerfully from the house's chimney, and a knot of tension in his chest began to loosen. He found Cora in the kitchen, kneading dough for the evening meal. Leo was at the table, carefully drawing a picture of a horse on a piece of scrap paper. A scene of such profound domestic peace greeted him that for a moment he could only stand in the doorway and watch. "Cora," he said, his voice hoarse. She looked up, her hands white with flour. "Elias, you're back. The storm was a bad one." Over the next hour, the story came out. It was told not by Cora, but by the men. By Samuel's quiet, factual account of her plan. By Ben's enthusiastic retelling of her confrontation with Croft. Even Jed offered a grudging, "She took charge, did what had to be done." They told him how she had organized the rescue, how her knowledge of the land had saved the herd, and how her shrewd intelligence had broken Silas Croft. Elias listened, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never left Cora. He had left his ranch in the hands of a probationary housekeeper and returned to find it had been defended by a general. He had seen her competence, but he had not understood its depth, its ferocity. She had not just done her job, she had saved his legacy. Later that evening, after the meal was done, and the men had retired to the bunkhouse, Elias found Cora by the fire in the main room. She was mending a tear in his coat, her needle moving with swift, sure stitches. Leo was asleep in her cabin. The house was quiet. "They told me what you did," he began, his voice low. Cora did not look up from her work. "We all did what needed to be done." "No," he said, stepping closer. "You did what no one else could. You saw what no one else saw. You held this place together when it should have fallen apart." He paused, searching for the right words. The plain, direct language of a cattleman felt inadequate for what he needed to say. When I hired you, he continued, I offered you a 30-day trial. Room and board, a chance. Cora's hands stilled. She looked up at him now, her gaze steady in the firelight. I was wrong, he said. It was the ranch that was on trial, and you are the one who has given it a chance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. It was not a bill or a ledger. It was a legal document, drawn up by the lawyer in redemption. Cora unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the words, her breath catching in her throat. It was a deed of partnership. It offered her a quarter share of the Thorn Ranch, free and clear. It named her as a full partner in the operation, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. This is, she whispered, unable to find the words. It was more than she had ever imagined. It was not wages. It was a home. It was a future, written down in ink and made real. It's not enough, Elias said quietly, for what you've done. But it's a start. This ranch, it needs you, Cora. I need you. The last words were spoken so softly she almost didn't hear them, but they landed with more force than the blizzard's wind. It was not a business proposition. It was a confession of the heart. Tears welled in Cora's eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed in a very long time. They were not tears of sorrow or desperation, but of overwhelming, unexpected grace. She had come here seeking only survival, a place to stand. She was being offered a place to belong. She folded the paper carefully and stood up. She was no longer just the housekeeper, and he was no longer just her employer. They were something new, something undefined. Partners. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I accept. He did not smile, but the deep weariness in his eyes seemed to lift, replaced by a light she had never seen there before. It was hope. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, shared understanding. The bargain was sealed, not for 30 days, but for a lifetime. The final scene unfolded not with a grand declaration, but in the quiet rhythm of a new beginning. It was a week later. The snow was beginning to melt under a warm Chinook wind, revealing the green promise of the grass beneath. In the kitchen, Cora was teaching Leo how to crimp the edges of a pie crust. The boy was still silent, but for the first time in months he smiled, a genuine, delighted smile as his small fingers made a pattern in the dough. Elias Thorne sat at the table, not with his customary pile of paperwork, but with a cup of coffee, simply watching them. He was not observing an employee, he was watching his family. The house was filled with the warm, sweet smell of baking apples. The men's voices could be heard from the yard, the sound easy and content. The ranch was alive. It was healthy. It was whole. Cora looked up and met his gaze across the room. In that shared look, 1,000 unspoken words were exchanged. Gratitude, respect, a deep and abiding sense of peace. The Thorn Ranch had been looking for a hired hand, a cook to feed its men. What it got was the woman who made it a home,